Thanks everybody for being here. Great to be back with my Jewish learning. See a lot of familiar faces and names and some new ones as well. What a wonderful thing to study Torah. People all over the country and world before Shabbat. I'm going to drop in the chat a link to the source sheet. I'll also do a lot of screen sharing, but in case you prefer to open it on a different device or manipulate the text as you like, you have that option now. Julie, maybe if the chat gets, if more people come in or if the chat gets periodically populated, just repost it for other people as need be. So we read Parashat Tetzaveh. We're coming in the home stretch of the book of Shemot, Exodus. Last week in Truma, we read of all the details for the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the architecture and of the building, as well as the construction guidelines for all of its accoutrements. This week, we more move to the Kohanim, to the clothing, the fashion design, and other aspects of preparation of the Kohanim for serving in the Mishkan. And then we'll have one more story next week in Ki Tisa of the revelation gone awry with the golden calf and the destruction and the reconstitution of the relationship. And then finally, we'll close out the book, Vayakhel Pekudei, with basically the after God relents and allows the people to still be in a relationship, the fulfillment of Truma and Tetzaveh in Vayakhel Pekudei, the assigning, the building of the Mishkan and the assigning of the Kohanim. So that's where we're at now. I'm going to share my screen, and let's just try to read carefully the beginning of our parsha. There's a sort of lilting rhythmic tone to all of these details that can be very comforting and aesthetically soothing, and also can be a little hypnotizing, such that we can sometimes dull our close literary attention that we might be used to in legal or narrative sections. So I want us to do extra work to keep our usual close literary reading hats on, to notice some peculiarities in the very beginning of our parsha. Here we go. So our parsha begins in the last two verses of chapter 27. I should say before we start, the chapters, there are a lot of different ways of dividing up the Torah. As you know, when you open up, or as you may know, as you open up a Torah scroll, which Julie has written several of, as you open up a Torah scroll, there are periodic line divisions in some places where the tradition requires starting a new line. Sometimes there's an opening at the end of a line. But there's never any marking outside of the words themselves and the artistic crowns on letters. There are no other markings, no vowels, no punctuation, and no topic headings and no chapter markings. Both Jewish and Christian early scholars, for study purposes, did impose chapter breakings. The chapters that the whole world of Bible readers today is accustomed to using are Christian impositions. Imposition sounds like a negative word. I don't mean it that way. Are Christian innovations to help organize the text. In most cases, the editorial breakup of the text is fairly intuitive, and early rabbinic breakdowns and Christian breakdowns are the same because it's pretty intuitive and obvious. Sometimes there will be a difference by just a couple of verses. And that is always something that should make us say, like, what is going on? Why was a difference perceived here? So this is one of those spots. We're going to begin anytime you see our parsha begins in a place that is 2 verses before the beginning of what the Christians call a chapter heading, that itself is an interesting machloket, an interesting literary dispute as to how to understand the literary breakdown of a text. So that's what I want us to pay attention to at the beginning. I have the Hebrew on the right side. If you have facility, that is great. I'm going to start us reading in the English. Our parsha begins, and as for you, Ve'ata, God is still speaking to Moses, Moshe, a big speech that began, all last week's parsha. You instruct the Israelites to bring to you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting, for continual kindling lamps, the Ner Tamid. In the tent of meeting outside the curtain, which is over the testimony, Aharon and his sons shall set them up from evening to morning before Hashem. In eternal law throughout your generations, on the part of the children of Israel. Christians now have a marking there, chapter 28, verse 1. And as for you, you draw near to you Aharon your brother and his sons with him from amidst the children of Israel to serve as priests for me. Aharon, Nadav, and Avihu, Elazar, and Itamar, the sons of Aharon. And you shall make garments of sanctity for Aharon your brother, for glory and for splendor. And as for you, you speak to each who is wise of mind, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, chokhmah, but in the Torah, chokhmah usually means like art, not like philosophy, but like practical artisanal skill. So, that they may make Aharon's garments to sanctify him to serve as priests for me. And these are the garments that they are to make: breastpiece, and ephod, and tunic, braided coat, wound turban, and sash. So they are to make garments of sanctity for Aharon your brother and for his sons to serve as priests for me. And as for them, they are to take gold, blue violet, purple, worm scarlet, and byssus. So here's my question. Let's start with the Christians. Why do we think, if we remember what we said before, that Parashat Truma, the previous parsha, the previous several chapters, were all about the construction of the tabernacle and its accoutrements, and the new parsha is all about the priests and their clothing and preparation. Why do the Christians put the break where it is? After that, we'll ask why the rabbis make the different breakdown starting our parsha 2 verses earlier than the Christians. Let's start with the Christians. I think that's a little bit easier. I'm going to stop the screen share for a minute so we can see each other. Feel free to raise your hand and Julie will unmute you if you have a thought about why the Christians put the dividing line at that place 2 verses later than the rabbis did. Stephen Lamb, see your hand there. Thanks for volunteering. You can unmute yourself, or Julie will unmute you.
Unmute. Okay. Because the Christians thought of the eternal lamp as being part of the structure rather than of dressing.
Right. Very good. I think that's the obvious. In this case, I think we started with the Christian reading because it's actually the more intuitive, more obvious reading. Even I, a Jewish reader, informed by Jewish Parshanut, still broke down these 2 parshiyot. Truma is about the Mishkan, Tetzaveh is about the Kohanim. And then those of us who describe it that way will have to just make an exception about these first 2 psukim, these first 2 verses that are about the Ner Tamid. The Ner Tamid, the eternal lamp, is one of the accoutrements of the Mishkan. So thank you, Stephen. That, I think, is a very intuitive response. So really, when it's so obvious that way, it really, if we remember everything else that came before the Ner Tamid, it was about all the other components of the Mishkan: the table, the bread, the gold trim, all of the architecture, all of the utensils. And then everything that comes after our text here is more about the Kohanim and their bodies and clothing and work. Why didn't we read the Ner Tamid, those 2 verses about the Ner Tamid, at the end of last week? That's how the Christians would have divided it up. An obvious question. So let's now turn to the rabbinic breakdown. Why do you notice anything literarily that might have signaled to the rabbis to put this breakdown 2 verses earlier and to link the commandments of the Ner Tamid with the commandments about the Kohanim? Feel free to raise your hand with the I see Esther Westelman's flesh and blood, real hand. Esther, yeah, go ahead.
Because I think in this parasha, the word eternal, Tamid, keeps repeating itself. לנצח נצחים, לדור ודור. So I think the idea of continuity is very important.
Okay. I don't remember where we see Netzach there, but Ledorotam does appear a couple times. So maybe there are thematic things about, although in biblical Hebrew, I'm not sure, well, in modern Hebrew, Tamid tends to mean uninterrupted. In biblical Hebrew, it probably means regular, like every day. It's not, in our modern synagogues, the idea of a Ner Tamid is that it's never out, whereas in the Bible, it's probably that it's ignited every single day. So, but there still is a potential thematic connection there. Very nice. Okay. I saw Jennifer Malvin, you had a hand before.
Yeah, and Jennifer posted the question in the chat. If you could re-clarify the distinction between the chapter breakdown and the parsha breakdown that our rabbis.
Sure. Okay, so once again, just to be clear, if you look at the sheet here, the text that you have is the very beginning of Parashat Tetzaveh. In other words, when you go to shul tomorrow and hear the Torah reading, it begins at this place. In other words, the rabbis are telling us this is the beginning of a new literary unit. The Christian breakdown, if you open up a Bible, including a Jewish Bible, a Jewish publication of the Bible, everybody uses these chapter markings now, but there are good Christian innovations. You'll notice that there's a chapter, the beginning of our parsha isn't the beginning of a new chapter. It's the very end of a previous chapter, and then a new chapter starts 2 verses later, as if to say the Christians thought that these first two verses of our Jewish parsha actually go with last week's parsha. And Stephen gave, I think, a very solid explanation as why. Last week's parsha, what the Christians call chapter 27, was all about the accoutrements of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And so are these 2 verses about the oil for the Ner Tamid. Then the next verses shift topic to the persons of the Kohanim, the priests, and their preparation. And now Esther has given us a first suggestion as to why the rabbis might have seen this literary unit differently and linked these 2 verses, verse 20 and 21, with what came later, as opposed to what came before. So let's hear a couple other suggestions. You got that? Thanks, Jennifer. I see. How about Karen Fitzgerald?
Perhaps the rabbis used it as a device to remind us to remember where we've been on our path to where we're going in this storytelling, because memory is tremendously important in the Jewish tradition, perhaps.
Can you say a little more, Karen, about what that has to do specifically with the passage about the Ner Tamid, the oil, being linked with the priests as opposed to being linked with the accoutrements of the tabernacle? What is it about memory that would indicate to put the dividing line here rather than there? You're muted, Karen.
Oh, okay, thank you. I couldn't unmute. I'm so sorry. I am afraid I'm not versed well enough to make a comment like that. And because I'm new to studies and I'm not Jewish, that is what made sense to me.
Okay. So I'm inviting everybody again. See what you notice. Even with that, we're not asking it to tap into prior knowledge, but about seeing what we notice, trusting that our earlier readers were noticing things that are before us too. I want to call on Ivan Linares, and then we'll see if there's time for one more question after that. Unmute. Yeah.
Hi. One thing I noticed by reading both the Hebrew and the English, there's no Spanish, is that I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time that Aaron and his sons are mentioned, and it's an anticipation for them becoming the priests and the people in charge. So in that sense, it connects immediately with verse 28:1, Parashat 28:1, when the instruction, the direct and clear instruction comes. But on the one of 27:21, he mentions Aaron and his sons shall set them up. Why them? So I see that as an anticipation of the future role, which is an extremely important role, that it's going to be mentioned in detail and directly in the beginning of Tetzaveh.
Okay, great, thank you. So because the end of chapter 27, the laws of the eternal lamp, mentions that it has to be tended by Aharon and sons,
yes,
maybe the rabbis link it to what's coming next. Very good.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's plausible. Don, I think this will be the last question on this unit. You can post other questions in the comments and we'll come back to more later. Go ahead, Don.
Could it be a nuance of language?
Share what you're seeing.
Well, the Hebrew ends at a certain place according to its total story, but in the translation to a Christian Bible, whether it be Greek or Aramaic or whatever, the emphasis on paragraphs might become a different strength or a different viewpoint.
Okay. So with that invitation to pay attention to language, and perhaps one of the other several hands that are up has been anticipating this, and if so, kudos. I'm going to share screen again and draw our attention to a specific linguistic unusual feature. Notice the way this begins. And I've translated as, and as for you, you instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives. Maybe there should be a simpler translation, just, and you instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives. Let me explain in Hebrew grammar what's going on here. The verb tetzaveh is already second person command or second person imperative or future singular, second person future. And the general way, if it was following, like, and we don't necessarily need in Hebrew the pronoun of atah. You could, most of the verbs, the command forms in the previous parsha, if we were just continuing, would say, V'tzaveh et b'nei Yisrael v'yikhu elecha, and command and instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives, etc. What's going on with this emphatic addition of the pronoun? And you, the word tetzaveh already has you inscribed into its grammar, and most of the command verbs, God has been speaking to Moshe this entire time. Why now this kind of doubled emphasis, and as for you? And notice that there's a leitmotif. That's a fancy literary jargon for a literary term that recurs. The very next section, beginning of our parsha, Ve'ata hakrev, and as for you, you draw near to you, Aharon, your brother and his sons. Verse 3, Ve'ata tidaber el kol chachmei lev, and as for you, you speak to each who is wise of mind. I think the rabbis are noticing a pattern starting with the commandment of the Ner Tamid, the lamp, the oil, of this emphasis on Moshe's role. You, as for you, what's your role going to be? Here's what you have to do. Even though God is in a long speech that has been detailing Moshe's responsibility for a long time. You tell them to do this, then they do this. You instruct them to do this. But here, there's this 3 times in just 5 verses, 3 times, Ve'ata, 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 and as for you. It's unusual language. That unusual language becomes even more heightened when you realize that this entire section, the duration of Parashat Tetzaveh, the rest of the laws about the Kohanim, even though it's directed toward Moshe to prepare the Kohanim, the priests, Moshe's name is never mentioned. We never hear a new Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying. In fact, from the beginning of Exodus, when baby Moshe is born, until the end of the Torah, 4 books later, Parashat Tetzaveh is the only parasha in which Moshe's name does not appear. This whole parasha has no mention of Moshe. And yet, at the beginning, he's especially highlighted. So he's simultaneously rendered absent and emphasized, highlighted at the same time. We might have missed that had we not seen the connection with this 3 times in a row, Ve'ata, Ve'ata, Ve'ata. And what we see in the end of chapter 27 might actually be connected to what Ivan mentioned, that the Torah already there about the Ner Tamid starts with this emphasized but absent Moses about the Ner Tamid, because that's something that is the role of the Kohanim. In other words, we seem to see at the beginning of our parsha an emphasis of that Moses is simultaneously diminished, erased, and emphasized at the same time. He's put behind the scenes, but emphasized. Ve'ata, ve'ata, ve'ata. What's the tone with which we should hear God's speaking to Moshe? As for you, you do this, you do this, you do this. As for you, you do this, you do this. And let's draw attention to what the tasks are for which Moshe is emphasized that way. Emphasized and diminished. Emphasized and diminished. Listen to the language. Try to put yourself in Moshe's shoes for a moment. His experiences, his knowledge, his supreme knowledge. He has just been or is currently on the mountain. He's the only person to be spoken to directly from God. Last week's parsha in 4 different places says he's been literally shown the blueprint. God showed Moshe a blueprint for everything about the Mishkan. Nobody knows this better than Moshe. How is Moshe going to experience being told, as for you, well, you draw near to you Aharon, your brother, and his sons with him from amidst the children of Israel to serve as priests for me. Aharon, Nadav, and Avihu, Eleazar, and Itamar, the sons of Aharon. And you shall make garments of sanctity for Aharon, your brother, for glory and for splendor. And as for you, you speak to each who is wise of mind, that they may make Aharon's garments, to sanctify him to serve as a priest for me. And these are all these fabulous threads that they should make, a breastpiece, piece, an ephod, and tunic, They would make garments of sanctity for Aharon, your brother, and his sons to serve as priests for me. Let's brainstorm a little bit. how do you imagine Moshe might have reacted to that? I see in the chat, Lori said, when my parents said, and as for you, is because they were not happy with me. Perhaps God has a beef with Moses at this time. Good, some Midrashim read it that way. We'll have to try to think about why or what is the cause of that. But maybe this is a diminishing of Moshe. In other words, like we're so used to, those of us who have read and been through scripture numerous times, it seems obvious that like, Moshe is the teacher and Aharon's the priest. The Midrashim, imagine, this must have been like a shocking and upsetting piece of news to Moshe. He presumably would have assumed all along that he would be the high priest. Who knows this stuff better than he does? He's literally been shown a divine blueprint on Mount Sinai of what it's supposed to look like. And all along throughout Parashat Terumah, imagine the rabbis, not even just imagine, but even sensitively read the rabbis, Moshe might quite reasonably have assumed that he is now in line to carry this out. He is the leader of the people. And now our Parsha has this great reveal. Ve'ata, get behind the scenes. Your role is to dress up your brother and your nephew so that they get all the glory. L'kavod u'l'tifaret. These words that are usually associated with God and divinity. You are supposed to be the divine haberdasher. Not even the haberdasher. Bezalel will make the clothes. You just put them on him backstage, and he's going to get all the glory. Let me just see if there are other comments. Moses did tell God to blot his name out of the book. Thank you, Tanya. That's coming next week's Parsha, but a lot of Kitisa, a lot of commentators have good literary reason to imagine that the events of Kitisa, the golden calf, happened before Truma and Tetzaveh. That's a big dispute. Many people think, like the Ramban thinks that the Parashiyot are told chronologically. Rashi and others have not proof, but decent literary evidence that maybe the chronology is different. The golden calf happened earlier, and the building of the tabernacle is a response to that. But the laws are given in continuation with the civil laws of Mishpatim. So that's a famous old rabbinic debate. And if Tanya's right, basically you're following Rashi, you're in very good company, that Kitisa came before Truma and Tetzaveh. And so when Moshe said, hey, if you do that, if you erase these people, blot my name out of the book, well, God capitulated to Moshe, but jabbed him in the nose a little bit too. Oh, you're so if you're gonna drop a threat like that, then I'll blot your name out from one chapter. Yeah, Sheila says this puts Moses into the role of a servant. Exactly. And maybe that was shocking and upsetting. Hands over the future to Aaron. Do not elevate any individual regard to Moses earlier. Steve mentions, didn't Moshe earlier profess to have difficulty speaking and to be unhappy as a leader? Great observation. Many of the Midrashim draw a connection there too, and actually understand this as a punishment for Moshe. He would have had it all. He would have had prophecy, kingship, and the priesthood, except that he was so difficult at the burning bush and said, no, please select anyone else. I can't speak. I can't do it. God had literally said, you can do it. And he's like, no, I can't do it. God's like, fine. You know who can speak? Aharon. So you know who's going to get the glory? Aharon. There's some Midrashim that read it that way. Very good anticipation, Steve. What do garments of sanctity mean, asks Richard. These items of clothing that are only to be worn in carrying out Kodesh, sanctified holy duties. In other words, in doing the sacrificial rite and in the state of purity. They're not just nice clothes, they're clothes specifically dedicated for that purpose. Just reading through oh God, there's so many. Okay, I'm not going to be able to read through all this. Let's hear a different Jennifer Malvin's. Perhaps Hashem is having Moshe act in a way that he acts, with humility, acting on behalf of the less fortunate. It's a wonderful anticipation of a midrash that we're going to look at momentarily, Jennifer. But you all have just, once you notice this viata and this question, you have anticipated the whole range of midrashim. Don asked, wasn't Aharon more popular with the people? Well, we haven't seen that. We might suspect that, but we haven't actually seen Aharon interact with the people. Aharon, we saw him coming to meet Moshe. We see him being a spokesman in some of the plagues to Pharaoh. We haven't really seen Aharon interact with the people. I see a couple of other hands up. Betsy Stark, why don't you unmute and share an observation or a question?
I think it has a lot to do with not wanting to elevate any individual over God. Look what happened with Jesus. He became God, an individual person. And that's just what we want to do. We want a king. Look what happened in the country. So that's just my...
And in the Bible as well, the people like badger and pressure Shmuel, the prophet. They're like, we need a king, we need a king. And he's like, it's going to go very badly. Already back in the book of Judges, they badger Gideon, like, we need a king, we need a king. And it's like, God is your majesty. A king is going to go badly. And Shmuel's like, fine. You want a king? You know what the king's going to do? The king's going to exploit you. The king is going to draft your sons for boondoggle, self-aggrandizing military expeditions. And guess what happens the entire duration of the books of Shmuel and Melachim? Almost every single one of the kings are corrupt and sinners. The main chunk of the Bible is the lambasting of properly appointed Jewish governments in the land of Israel being utterly corrupt, and the responsibility of proper Jewish leadership to oppose them. That is the central theme of the Tanakh in the books. Like, you have a king, it's not going to go well. Be that as it may, Jennifer and Betsy, I think, have especially anticipated a really interesting theme. Now, there are some midrashim that imagine Moshe being really excited, a consistent theme of his kind of like reticence for this whole leadership thing in the first place. But he's like really excited that his older brother now gets some shine, and he's happy to have that role. And those are great midrashim too. We're not going to look at them. I do want to share one midrash with you that has been anticipated by some of you. It's a fascinating text in Shmot Rabbah 37:4. Listen to the way the rabbis kind of read between the lines and try to imagine the dynamic between God and Moshe here. And as for you, you draw near to you, Aharon, and so on. This is like what was written in Psalms. Had your Torah not been my plaything, then I would have perished in my poverty. Lulei Toratcha she'ashu'ai, azavadati ve'oni. I wonder what's this got to do with it? The rabbis explain. When the Holy Blessed One said to Moshe, and as for you, you draw near to your brother, and then deck out your brother and his sons for kavod and tiferet, and make them so honored and resplendent, and you get to make them so glorious. God did injury to Moshe. Heralo, it was ra to him. It hurt Moshe. He was devastated. It was supposed to be him. The Midrash imagines. There are other Midrashim that imagine differently. He would have been happy about it. But here, we're imagining maybe Moshe it wasn't even a question. Obviously, he would be the Kohen. And when he first hears about this, it really upsets him. God said to him, hey, dude, I had the Torah and I gave it to you. That without which I would have lost my world. It's a reading of Psalm 119. In other words, Psalm 119 verse 92 is a quote from God speaking to Moshe. Lulei Toratcha Sha'ashuai Azavaditiv Oni. God saying, if your Torah, that Torah that I gave to you, had not been a plaything for you, I would have lost my world. I had the most precious thing, something without which I would have lost or maybe destroyed my world, and I gave it to you. How much do you want, dude? I think that's the tone of, like, God's looking, like, what is your expectation? You're really upset that Aharon gets the shine with these clothes and you have this background? I gave you Torah as a plaything. Now then the Midrash makes a mashal. A mashal is a parable to bring it back to earth. Sometimes with cultural difference, the parable for us can be actually more difficult to access. This is one of those cases. So I want to just give a kind of content warning. There's a comparison to a marriage model that we would view as a felony today, but is very common in the rabbinic imagination. We're going to have to do some unpacking and translating it to a non-erotic or non-marriage context, because there's a structural power imbalance. I just want to like frame that this is a lot of old texts before modern times. So this is likened to a wise man who married his relative, a male wise man who married his female relative, his krova. And they lived together 10 years. She hadn't given birth. The halacha, the law, is that if a couple marries 10 years, they're infertile, then the man should try with somebody else. Maybe the problem is the woman's infertility. And eventually, if that they're also infertile, then we assume the problem's the man, and we don't want other women to marry him. So there's a concern about continuity and fertility here. Not much concern about love relationships on their own right, be that as it may. So he said to her, his wife, who's now being like low-key implicitly blamed for his infertility, he says to her, hey, go seek me a wife. Wow, what an insult. Like, you know, she has to be the one to find her own replacement. He said to her, I could marry without your permission. It's not that I need you to do it, but I seek your invitanutech. I seek your, it's a complicated word. It can mean humility, related to the word anava. It could mean forbearance, like having a right to object, but having the discipline and restraint not to claim what is rightfully yours. It's a word that holds all those diverse meanings. So too did HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, say to Moshe, I could have made your brother the high priest without your consent or knowledge or being informed, but I thought that you shall be great over him. Now, we have to do a little translation. The marriage thing is not a successful metaphor today, because today, if there's structural hierarchy in a marriage, we call that a felony, and like we're not able to, and we restrict those kinds of relationships, or at least we aspire to. But there's a hierarchical situation. More imagine it as like a parent-child or boss-employee situation, where somebody has, the child who is being who thought to be favored or set up for a purpose, and it hasn't necessarily happened yet, is now having to go and seek out the replacement. And God says, it's not that I needed you to do that. No, when a parent says to a child, like, you go and, like, I don't know, I'm giving your sibling all of your toys, and you have to go teach them how to use them, or something like that. It's not that I need you to do it. I could give them to the other kid myself. I think it's going to be good for you, even though it hurts. It's going to be good for you to be involved in that process. Notice the language too. In the mashal, in the parable, the language is, I want to cultivate your invitanutech, your forbearance, your humility. But in the nimshal, in the application of the parable, it's that I sought that you shall be great over him. Gadol alav. In other words, for this midrash, the real meaning of greatness, even comparative greatness, is forbearance. Moshe, you're not going to achieve true greatness by having all the shine. In order for you to achieve true greatness, you have to practice forbearance, restraint. That's really going to be where you shine, where you're a special kind of light, perhaps with the plaything of Torah. That's where you are really going to achieve greatness. And that links us to a text in the Talmud Bavli, where Rabbi Yochanan says, wherever you find the gvura, the might of God, you also find God's invitanuto, God's humility or restraint. It's written in the Torah, it's repeated in the prophets, and stated a third time in the writings. In the Torah, the book of Devarim, chapter 10, Deuteronomy, for Adonai your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords. How does the verse explain how God is so mighty, God of gods, Lord and lords? God executes the judgment of the fatherless and the widow, the orphan and the widow. That's what makes God great, is diminishing God's self to be with those who have been rendered invisible and powerless by society. That's God's greatness. In the prophets, in the Haftarah we read on Yom Kippur, from Isaiah end of 57 into 58. Thus says the high and lofty one, Shochein Ram V'Nisa Shochein, the high and lofty one that inhabits eternity, whose name is sacred. In the high and holy place I dwell with the one who is of contrite and a humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. In Psalms, extol the one who rides upon the clouds, whose name is Yah, father of orphans and the judge of widows. As Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg puts this in her book, The Particulars of Rapture, as God displays a magnanimous imagination in nurturing the less impressive members of society, so Moses is to realize in himself an empathy for those who are stripped of power. It is lost, divestment of the priestly robes, that is to open up for him an alternative sensibility. I think what the rabbis are sensitively picking up by linking those two verses of the Ner Tamid to chapter 28 is this theme, the major theme of our parsha, isn't just the fashion design of the Kohanim's clothes. The major theme is Moshe's transition to a more profound, divinely imitating greatness through diminution. To tell us that we should be very, very suspicious and non-trusting of charismatic, dynamic leaders who make the story about them, who are never put themselves in a position of public service and horizontal service of making sure that they're with the others. Moshe was at risk if he had this role also of making Torah about him. It's Moshe's true greatness is being able to take the role of the unsung preparer. All of us need whenever somebody's in public, there is a whole team of people behind the scenes who have made it possible. Putting Moshe in that role and erasing his name and emphasizing you, this is what you are all about. It's signaling to us the importance of emulating the embrace and the celebration and the recognition of true, powerful, divine greatness and leadership of everybody who is behind the scenes, who does the little things, who does the unsexy, uncelebrated, non-public preparation work. That is true great leadership, and one that even Moshe is set up for. And I think we can imagine that even if the initial instruction he felt as a bit of a punch in the nose, that eventually it became something to really embrace as he understands his role, even from behind the scenes, is with the plaything of Torah. Torah as a precious, pampered toy through which we can generate our inventiveness, our subtleties, and our joy and beauty into the world. And I'm going to turn it back to Julie.